Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today here for the annual Health and Wellness Expo hosted by Campus Recreation. We're really thankful for all of our presenters that we had throughout these past couple of days. And we also encourage you to continue to attend as many of these sessions as possible. We have, I believe, one or two left later this evening. I'll go ahead and drop in the chat real quick the link that you can visit where you can see what else we have left in the expo. So just a couple of items before we get started. This session is being recorded and you will be able to refer to it back on our website. And they should be uploaded by next Wednesday, April 21st. We ask that you please keep yourself muted during the presentation unless directed otherwise. And we encourage you to use the chat for questions and comments. And just in case you haven't heard, everyone who does attend a session is entered to win a t-shirt or a Campus Rec water bottle. You'll be emailed if you are a winner. And the more sessions that you attend, the more chances that you have to win. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Cassidy to get started.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending our panel today on living economic justice. So this panel was organized by our senior capstone students in the Public Relations program in the Edelman College of Communication and Creative Arts. Each year, the capstone students host a panel discussion on some of the most important issues facing the world. Our previous topics include gentrification, the prison system, and the role of media in elections. So at this time, I'd like to introduce the 9 capstone students who organized this event. So I'm Cassidy Anderson.
My name is Daniel Espinoza.
I'm John Hartshorn.
My name is Jennifer McGraw.
I'm Emily Preziosi.
I'm Nick Richardson.
My name is Erica Ruderman.
Hi, I'm Madison Sweet.
I'm Kelly White.
And our professor is Dr. Allison Novak. So this panel is co-sponsored by the Thrive Expo, Rowan's Affordability Task Force, PRSSA, and DEI SB3. So our topic today is economic justice. Economic justice is the concept that the economy will be increasingly successful if it is fair to all. The idea of economic justice addresses wage gaps, the building of corporations, and the equity of economic establishments. Economic justice aims to give equitable resources to all so that everyone has a fair chance to lead a successful life. So some examples of where we see economic justice impact our daily life include differences in wages between genders, races, ethnicities, and even religious groups, differences in how various groups are able or encouraged to apply for loans from banks and financial institutions, differences in access to affordable housing, food and health services between racial groups, and differences in financial penalties for convicted individuals. So economic justice is important because it's designated as a key area contributing to inequity between groups. It's identified by the Department of Education as a literacy skill needed in kindergarten to high school education, and it was searched 8 million times on Google in 2020. So today we are joined by Roxy Patton, who is the Director of Social Justice, Inclusion, and Conflict Resolution in Rowan's Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Dr. Dawn Singleton, Senior Director of Student Success and Inclusion Programs. Thank you, Roxy and Dr. Singleton, for joining us today in a conversation about economic justice. And without further ado, let's get started on these questions.
So for our first question, it is, how would you explain the idea of economic justice to someone who is not familiar with the topic? What would you suggest doing to get involved in the conversation?
So I think everyone is impacted by economic justice issues, but not everyone realizes how they're impacted by them. So I think the first thing we can do when we're opening up the conversation is to start talking about the basic ways that economic justice shows up. And so one of the things that I always share, so I'm from rural Appalachia. I come from central Appalachia, which has a 57% high school graduation rate, and it's considered one of the most impoverished areas in the country. And so one of the things that I talk about, especially when I go back to my region, is the historical impact of why the region sees such great economic disparity. and how the economic injustice that we're seeing in that region has a ripple effect throughout the country. So even when we start to think about political candidates and the stronghold they might take in certain regions, we know that access to financial literacy, access to having access to financial resources impacts the way we think, we understand the type of schooling that we have access to, the type of candidates that we're more likely to vote for, all of those things, and who we vote for has a very real world impact on the things that's happening. So one of the things that I try to do when I'm opening these conversations is to talk about the ripple effect, that when we think about economic justice, we often think about the individual person, rather than recognizing that it's systemic in nature, and that one person in our community who's being impacted by economic injustice really truly impacts all of us. And some of that also comes from within Appalachia. Appalachia is a collectivist culture. The United States in more broadly is individualistic, thinking what's in it for me? How do I get myself ahead? How do I advance? In collectivist communities, we ask, how do we move forward together? What's best for one person in our community is what's best for all of us. If anyone is suffering, all of us are suffering. So I think to get engaged, we have to shift our mindset to recognizing that we are responsible for the well-being of people around us, that we are responsible for moving forward economic justice, because one person's suffering is all of our suffering.
I would probably move in that same vein. In fact, I definitely do, but I really focus on real world examples because I think, as Roxy mentioned, a lot of folks don't understand, and we also hold stereotypes when we talk about ideals and concepts of economic justice, right? So we have thoughts and stereotypes about homelessness. We have thoughts and stereotypes about what it means to be low income. And sometimes those don't connect with your own reality. So one of the things that I often do, because I do teach about this in one of the courses that I teach, is really giving examples of what homelessness in America looks like now, what it looks like to be working hand to mouth, right? Holding down 2 jobs and still not able to pay your rent or your mortgage or to buy groceries for the week, because we think that that's those people over there sometimes, and it's really could be your next door neighbor. As we know that many middle-class Americans are actually low-income Americans, right? And it's because we don't have that real-world experience. We don't know the struggle that just next door may be happening. And so I think for me, that's how I would get folks engaged in a conversation, is by giving them real world examples and trying to move away from those stereotypes that we have about what economic injustice means, because it really points back to the whole conversation of inequality and how that is manifested differently.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers. Dawn, you kind of touched upon this, but my question is, in what ways does economic injustice appear in our society?
Oh, so many ways, right? The list is long, but we can look at wage gaps, as I know you all mentioned, income inequality, access to healthcare, access to education, the social mobility of our citizens. You can really see themes of economic injustice in there, especially when we talk about folks that come from historically minoritized backgrounds, corporations and bringing businesses to inner cities. You see it impacted there. We have food deserts in some neighborhoods and areas of our country still, and that all is a product of economic injustice. And unpacking that is really going back to the root or the causal issue, right, of that thought process of why we're not bringing certain companies and corporations to certain neighborhoods. And that goes back to the whole idea of stereotypes and why you think that the money may not be good there, because there is no money there. And where does that come from? So I know I'm probably answering other questions within the question, but it definitely happens or manifests in those ways: income inequality, wage gaps, access to healthcare, access to education, the social mobility of minoritized folks. And I'll stop there and let someone else answer.
You were doing a great job, Dawn. I would add to that that it's cyclical, in that because of the stereotypes we hold as, and not just as individuals, but as a society, that then we do all have these wage gaps. We have where we think we should open businesses, where it's safe, where we'll make money, all of these different things, which then disproportionately continues to impact the same people, which then creates more stereotypes. Even thinking on the individual level, if anybody knows someone who's experienced homelessness, coming out of homelessness is extremely difficult, because once you're faced with economic injustice, in America, we have this concept of bootstrapping, right? That if you don't have access to solid finances, it's your own fault. You didn't try hard enough. You didn't work hard enough. The American dream, anybody can do it. If this person did it, then why can't you? So then when someone experiences this, they're gaslit about their own experiences. That's not real. What you're saying doesn't really happen. And then they're punished and ostracized. And so for folks, whether it's that they've experienced homelessness, or they came from the bad side of town, or they had less access to solid education, K through 12, there are penalties they will face for that throughout their lifetime, that have nothing to do with what type of person they are, or how intelligent they are, or how deserving they are, simply because of the economic barriers that they faced.
So kind of branching off of what you guys just talked about, because I think what you guys really mentioned ties into this question well. According to Forbes magazine, Black women are paid 21% less than white women. Why do you think that there is such a drastic wage gap between women of color and white women? And how do we strive to fix the racial aspects of economic injustice?
Well, I think that's a loaded question, but I think the answer is pretty evident, and we can find it in research, right? We know research tells us that Black women face different obstacles, sometimes unique obstacles in the workplace, in securing equal pay. So for women of color, that unique experience really sometimes, not really, but oftentimes results in wage gaps, right? And those wage gaps are in comparison to white men, Black men, and white women. They're still making more as it relates to that. And then those women, and this is not because there is a shortage of Black women going to college, getting degrees, or being able to apply for certain jobs. That number has certainly increased over the past couple of years, but there's historical racism, there's historical prejudices that they are not able to overcome. And so that creates barriers and obstacles for them. And we already have systemic issues of wage gaps, right? So all we see really is the outcome of that. All we see is the outcome of historical racism, and then the obstacles that are put in place for women in general, but those obstacles happen to be differently and experienced differently for women of color, and as it relates to the wage gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think understanding, what Dawn was saying, there are historic reasons why it looks the way that it does. So we think about the fact that leadership in the United States is shaped broadly from white Eurocentric ideas of what a leader looks like, and how that's a very patriarchal view of leadership. So then women are towing the line constantly of, we should be assertive, but not too assertive, because if you're too assertive, you're being mean and you get called very negative words. You have to be kind, but not too kind. It's that constant balance. And so you add, that's the stereotypes that women face. You add in that Black women also face stereotypes like the angry Black woman that they're monitoring. You add in stereotypes about what it looks like to be professional and how you can keep your hair. So when we think about moving up to those levels where people are paid more, that's also a big barrier. The other thing I always like to point out is, so usually I was so excited to see that this was even brought up, because usually when I hear the wage gap, it's only brought up about the statistics for white women, and it's just brought up as women blankly, not looking at these other pieces. But when we look at Latinas are paid 54 cents on the dollar for every dollar a white man makes. And then we look at APITA women, or Asian Pacific Islander and Desi American women, and they're making 90 cents for every dollar a white man makes, which is actually higher than white women. And we have to ask ourselves that same question. What are the stereotypes? What are the myths? What are the ideas that shape the inequality that we're seeing, and the impact of things like the myth of the model minority that has been thrust upon Asian communities, and this idea that Asian and APITA folks are more intelligent, more capable, and the gaps that they face in getting the support that they need. But that also leads to this discrepancy where people and their hiring biases are looking at their assumptions about someone's value or qualities based on their race and their gender.
You hit the nail on the head, and that was the piece that I wanted to impact, is that racism manifests into implicit bias, and that implicit bias creates these blockages, these barriers for women in all across, sectors of industry. And until you start looking at those bias and examining them, right, and having those really uncomfortable and difficult conversations, then we can't address the issues, right? We already know racism is an issue, but we have a lot of people who don't think that they're racist, or they think that it has nothing to do with wage gaps, but they don't understand how the two concepts and how the two struggles really correlate. And so when you can first admit that we have an issue, and then we can start unpacking what the issues are, then it gets better for women. It gets better for women of color, right? But it all boils back, or points back to, rather, that whole idea of implicit bias.
And I just add one more thing, that we're talking about one intersection of identity. We're talking about race and gender, but you could add in sexuality. What is it like for gay women, for gay Black women? What's it like for women who have disabilities? What's it like for trans women? And oftentimes we don't have the data about that, because these questions are so many layers deep that no one's asking them. So when we think about economic justice, we also have to consider whose stories are being told and whose are completely left out. We're not even aware of the gaps yet.
So that was a great question that you asked. And I think it really comes down to just like the racism in America, and how Black people historically have been paid less than white people. And then also looking at the patterns we see, people not going to college, their parents not going to college, and it's just like a trend. And it's just really hard to break. It's harder to go to college when no one in your family went to college. So it's also like less motivation if no one in your family went.
Erica, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, hang on just 1 second. Sorry, I'm working from my phone. Can you come back to me actually?
Yes, definitely. We can come back to you. Let's go on to Emily.
Yeah, hi. So my question is, what organizations or institutions are working towards addressing issues of economic injustice?
So I would say any organization that's working for a more socially just society is working towards economic justice. So there are organizations that their specific goal is economic justice, but I would say Black Lives Matter is working towards economic justice. I would say the environmental activists throughout Appalachia that are fighting fracking and coal mining are working towards economic justice. I would say the folks that are working towards the Stop Asian Hate campaign are working towards a more economically just society. So I think folks who are tackling racism, sexism, homophobia across the board are working towards economic justice. But there are some specific organizations, and I'd be happy to drop some links in the chat if folks are interested in getting involved with folks that are specifically working on economic justice.
Absolutely, Roxy. I was just going to add that I have a list of resources that I share with my class. One of them that immediately comes to mind is the National Jobs for All Coalition, and their group is primarily focused on creating jobs and employment and equality and livable wages for folks. So we will definitely drop in additional organizations. There are many labor unions that are specifically focused on the inequality gap and how they can, whether it be by state, whether it be by region, how folks can come together to address the issues of wage gaps and economic injustice.
Yeah, I think that'd be great if you guys can just drop those links in the chat. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Erica, were you ready to go back to your question before we jump to mine?
Yeah, so my question is, what do you think the origins of economic justice in the United States is?
So I just for clarity, are we talking about the movement of economic justice or really the foundations of economic injustice?
Really just the foundations of it.
Yeah. And I think it's all the isms. We have a long history in the United States of the isms and how they play out. So I'll give two very different examples. Right. So when we look at the enslavement of African people in the United States, some people say, well, that was so long ago, but recognizing there are generations of Black and African American folks that were not able to accrue financial security, were not allowed to own property or to pass on property and financial resources to their children, who were separated, so they weren't allowed to compile resources. So then you have that, and we kind of go, oh, that was really terrible, but look at all the time since then. Okay, let's talk about what happened next. Let's talk about Jim Crow. Let's talk about segregation. And if people are segregated and our education systems are developed in those segregated communities, lower income communities are going to get less access to education. Less access to education means less access to career mobility, means less access to more financially secure future. Then we move into things like redlining, which is where the banks would charge higher interest rate loans to applicants of color and force them into specific neighborhoods. Even after we weren't segregating anymore, we were still saying, if we have someone who's Black who's applying for a loan, we'll approve a loan in this neighborhood with an interest rate 5 times higher than we'll give a white person. They'll default on the home, we get all the money back, we can sell that house again. Right. So, and this was going on till the 1970s. This is well documented. This isn't some vast conspiracy theory. And one of the things that we know has one of the deepest impact on whether you will be financially secure is whether or not your parents owned a home. So home ownership, all of that came from racism. And yet we're still seeing families that are disproportionately impacted by that. I'll give another example in that I think it helps us to articulate and to identify that race is a social construct. You can see that I am alabaster, ivory, the whitest person on earth. I'm Scotch, Irish, Welsh. In early America, Scotch, Irish, Welsh folks were not considered white. And so that's why you see a lot of Scotch, Irish, Welsh folks throughout the Appalachian Mountain region, is we were kind of pushed there because it was believed to be unfarmable land. And there's, again, well documented, people were like, we really hope that these Irish rats will go out there and die. It wasn't subtle at the time. So when you look at the development of Appalachia, you can see where there was consistent legislation that pushed not to create roads and access to larger cities to keep the area secluded and separate. You look at things like the development of coal mines and what we call resource extraction zones. So outsiders came in and created these coal mines once coal was found in our region. None of that money went back into our communities. Our communities were absolutely devastated and destroyed with losing our mountains, losing our natural resources. Many of our families were impacted by things like black lung, where we still are seeing, even now, the advanced black lung that we're seeing in folks in their early 20s from the silica in the mines. That this is a really intense problem we're dealing with. But then they took it to another level. So does anybody know about the company stores? and why that was a problem in coal mining in particular, but we saw this in a lot of industries. So they're the only employer in the region paying anything. And they say, great, we're going to start paying you in notes to the company store. So I'm going to give you $50 and for your week of work, and you can only buy things from the store we own. And if I own everything, milk cost $15. So there's an old song by Tennessee Ernie Ford that says, I owe my soul to the company store, because these folks ended up indebted to the companies that they worked for and ended up working for free. Which is why we see the coal miners rebellion, which is one of the first major labor rebellions in the United States. But the impact of that is still seen. Like I said, my region of Appalachia still today has a 57% high school graduation rate, and the average life expectancy in my region is 58. 58. So that's when we talk about economic justice, understanding the racism, the classism, all of these different pieces that went into it, the long history. Even as we make adjustments, it could take decades, generations for that impact to equalize.
I think Roxy covered the gamut and gave a lesson on the Appalachia as well. So I don't have much to add. My short answer was racism, right? And then racism manifests into classism. It impacts social mobility. It impacts the ability to own homes, right? It impacts that whole idea of who is of privilege and who isn't as it relates to financial privileges. We look back and we can talk about Black people, we can talk about Asians, we can talk about the Irish, we can talk about Italians, Asian Americans, and we know that they all have a differing history as it relates to being an American, and based on what your status was when you came to this world, right? And so that really is where the differing and the socially constructed ideas of who are the haves and who are the have-nots happened in America. And everything that we see now is just a result of what happened in those times. And unfortunately, it's still going on, right? There's many things that Roxy identified as it relates to home ownership, as it relates to real estate and loans, that folks of minoritized backgrounds are still being targeted and given bad loans or not given loans at all. Then they can't buy homes in certain neighborhoods, or folks won't sell to them. So really, our situation is no different than it was 30 years ago, unfortunately. So the conversation or the concern is, we know these things happen, right? Why in 2021 can we not dismantle these systems, right? And then understand how we can begin to create equity as it relates to class, right? Equity as it relates to your race, your ethnicity. And I guess I'm just going down a rabbit hole, so I'm going to stop there.
Yes, thank you for those answers. So moving on to my question, you kind of started to touch on it, Dawn, but what problems are in the way of achieving economic justice? And when we address economic injustice, what resources do we need to help those that are affected?
It's funny you asked this. We were in a leadership team meeting earlier, Roxy and I, and we as a team just finished reading The New Jim Crow. And so we are finishing the last chapter, and it's kind of, what are the action steps that we need to move forward? Like, how can we create a system that is not going to only or create mass incarceration for men of color, and understanding that they're not the highest rate of folks committing crimes. So the question we kind of left out in the air was, people say tear the whole system up, dismantle it, but what does that look like, right? A lot of the work that we do in DEI are these gradual, incremental steps to create change, right? And then making sure that people are aware of their own bias, making sure they're aware of their own privileges, right? And understanding how you can be an ally while also not centering your own experiences. These are things that we're doing. I feel like those same things apply to economic justice. However, I feel like you could probably dismantle the whole, economic system a little bit easier than all of society, right? As it relates to race. But I think for me, it's a clean do-over understanding. But first, you would have to admit that the system does not provide access and opportunity for a very large group of people. It was not built for them, whether it be women's pay inequity, whether it be the inequity of opportunities and access for people of color. It would start with a very structured plan to dismantle the system and begin again. I think that that's the start. But again, I would repeat, if we can't admit that there's a problem, and unfortunately, a lot of people who are creating the policies, this is what we also talked about earlier, a lot of people who are sitting at the tables and have voice in those conversations are not the people in this conversation, right, who understand that there is an issue. So it becomes, how do we get our thoughts, our concepts, and how do we advocate? How does your generation advocate to start creating change and being change agents in that dismantling?
Yeah, I would say, so first of all, recognizing there are a lot more poor folks in the United States than there are rich folks. Across race, across gender, across culture, across religion, across sexuality, whatever you're saying, there are a lot more poor folks than there are rich folks. So then we have to ask ourselves, who benefits by the inequity that exists? What systems have been created to defend that inequity and protect that inequity? And what has prevented us from organizing together? I have well been known for saying that class solidarity above all else. And a lot of that comes from my experience growing up from a lower socioeconomic background, and realizing that folks raised in a lower socioeconomic background are constantly pitted against each other, because if we all came together, there would be no stopping us. So what do, right? When Black folks and Asian folks started organizing together, they create the myth of the model minority and pit them against each other and say, oh, see, look how well these folks assimilated. Look at these model minority folks. If you really tried, you could look like them, pit them against each other. When white Appalachian folks started organizing with enslaved people, what did they do? They started saying, no, you're really white. You don't need to help those folks. Think about it this way. They can be slaves. You'll be indentured servants. You'll be a step above them. Pit them against each other. When we started seeing coal miners working more and more and fighting for their rights and jobs moved overseas, what did they tell us? They told us, no, it's not that we moved overseas. It's that all those Black and brown folks are jumping the border and stealing your jobs. And that racism, there's always some outside force telling poor folks who to blame. And it's always somebody else who's being hit hard by the same policies. So I think as folks who want to engage in economic justice, we have to be knowledgeable intersectionally about this work to ask ourselves, what are the parties in play? What are the myths in play that are pitting folks against each other and reducing our ability to organize and have solidarity across class, across race, across gender, all of these different pieces. And to start organizing around that. How do we dismantle these misconceptions that we should be fighting each other for the crumbs of the table when somebody else is eating the whole steak dinner and a potato and 3 cheesecakes for dessert? And we're like, oh, but I got this graham cracker crumb from the crust. You can't have it. This one's mine, right? So I think there's that piece around the making sure that folks understand those pieces and how to address them.
Thank you. Seriously, those were some fantastic answers. And we're just going to kind of change the direction slightly here. My question is a little more local. Rowan is built on 4 pillars: access, affordability, quality, and economic engine. How do these pillars contribute to creating a culture of economic justice?
Well, I think that our pillars are very intentional as it relates to creating economic justice, especially when we mention the access and affordability pillars. I'm in a lot of meetings where we talk about affordability and access, right? And one of the main purposes of my role is to create access for my historically minoritized students. So in terms of where Rowan stands, I think we're situated, and we've made it we've made it explicitly clear that that is one of the goals of the institution. It's about making sure that everyone, be it department, be it division, be it academic department, is aligned with that vision, right? And then how do you do that? Because it's done so many different ways, right? It can be done by having inclusive pedagogy pedagogy in the classroom. It's done by having intentional activities just like this to educate the campus and surrounding community about the issues of inequality, right? It's done by creating a division of diversity, equity, and inclusion who is there to help and supplement what happens inside of the classroom as well as those who work at Rowan. So I think access, in terms of, if I go back to what access means, access is that we are providing pipeline programs, that we are providing a sense of belonging once students are here to understand that we're a place where there should be all these intersections of race, gender, of your sexuality, of your language, that this is a place where that is welcome. And that's what a college campus should be. It should be a place where all of these different backgrounds or intersections collide and we learn from one another. And I think that we see that at Rowan, and that's our espoused theory, so to speak. So that's what we say we're going to do, and everybody should be held accountable for doing that. So I do think when I think of economic justice, when I think of social justice, when I think about opportunity, I tend to think of those two pillars. I tend to think of access. I tend to think of affordability, and affordability puts in mind the idea that everybody can't afford to go to Rowan, right? Not everybody's parents are able to pay out of the pocket at Rowan. Not everyone here is without a loan. In fact, a large population of our students are receiving financial aid. So what does that mean? And so the president has put into place, and with the board and with supporters, that we're not going to be a person or institution where tuition is inflated every year. But what does that look like, right? To do those things, to be able to keep, tuition at a rate where it's not beyond you to find a package that will help you pay for it, where we have an affordability task force that for years have been working on ways to lower the cost of books and supplies, right? To be able to understand that a student needs to eat while they're here, and to be able to afford a meal plan sometimes takes you to having to take out a loan. And even having a meal plan doesn't mean that you're going to have food to eat outside of cafeteria hours. So then the shop was created for our students who are food insecure. So I think that we have done some intentional things to one, let students know that we understand that everyone has a differing background, that everyone is not from upper class, or even if you're from upper class doesn't mean that you have the funds, right? Because upper class, middle class, lower class, all of that is debatable in 2021, but that you have the funds to be able to pay for all that it costs. So what are programs that we can put into place? And we still have ways to go, but I think we've done a lot in those two areas so that there is some economic equality for students, and we're continuing to do more. We're still working on the options as it relates to housing. There's a wonderful team in student affairs, and they're looking at the cost inequity as it relates to the types of housing, right? And that they're wanting to create change in that way. So I think those are the two pillars that stand out to me the most when I think of where we are as an institution.
Yeah, I really don't have much to add. Dawn really covered it. But I would say, as someone who has a decade working in this field, I have seen my professional colleagues here engage in conversations around economic justice more than anywhere I've ever worked. In that, really, I think having those pillars charges every professional staff member with asking these questions. And it puts it right on the forefront of people's minds when they're creating programs, when they're looking at the services that we need to offer, that I think folks here are really intentional. And like Dawn said, there's so much work that has been done, and we also recognize there's so much left to do. But that I think by having that as part of our pillars, the affordability and access, it's a charge that's put on everyone who comes to work here.
Hi, thank you for those answers. Is this kind of continuing with the Rowan theme? What do you think we could do as students to like kind of achieve economic justice, or at least help the movement, like in day-to-day life?
So for one thing, I would say one of the most extraordinary privileges about being a college student is the opportunities to engage with these topics in ways that when you're working full time and you've got your your spouse or your family, it becomes a lot harder to earmark time for these issues. So I would say get involved in organizations that have a mission for dismantling systems of racism and sexism, homophobia. There are so many student organizations that are invested in this work. I think also, I mean, I got to do a little plug for my office. We're having these conversations, right? We're talking about economic justice and social justice. We have service opportunities. We have leadership opportunities. We have a social justice leadership retreat that happens each year that teaches young student leaders and students who want to be activists and social change agents how to do that. So I think there's those opportunities. There's class and course offerings. But I would say don't be afraid to get in and get your hands dirty, get in and get into those uncomfortable conversations that will help you become more aware of the barriers that you might have faced or that the people around you might have faced. Take those opportunities now to learn so that when you leave the institution, you know what steps to take, whatever your role in society is, because it might look a little different for you if you're a business major or if you're a sociology major or a theater arts major, right? That the way you do the work might shift, but if you understand the how, if you understand the why, and you feel like you have a good understanding of the barriers that the people around you face, you'll be better equipped to tackle them.
I definitely agree. Wouldn't add much. I would start with whatever is in your own local space, right? And the things that you're passionate about or you've experienced or you know someone that has experienced something, usually that's a great catalyst for creating change. And as young people, college students about to go out into the world, you have every ability and you're in a perfect position to be agents of change, right? So I wouldn't add anything else except for to reflect and then connect yourself to organizations, to resources, as you all have facilitated this conversation to do, to be able to better be a change agent.
I will add one more thing, is don't be afraid to join an organization because you think based on the title of the organization that you're not gonna fit, you don't hold that identity. I'll tell you, every student organization, regardless of who they serve, would love to have allies and accomplices in that organization. One of the most profound experiences of my undergraduate experience was joining Black Students United and really learning about my own ability to engage in anti-racism work and understanding the Black experience, what it means to sit and listen and not feel like I have all the answers or that I showed up with sympathy to save everybody. So be willing to show up, whether it's to an organization meeting if that organization's open, or to programs that organizations are putting on, because I think those will also open doors for you to understand experiences that are different from your own.
So moving now to kind of like a more personal question, and I wanted to add too real quick that something that you guys touched on earlier was talking about implicit biases. And I was fortunate enough in my class, we took a test. It was by the Project Implicit program that they have. So I'm actually going to drop that link in the bio or in the chat for anybody who's interested in taking the test. I thought it was really interesting to see what kind of implicit biases I still have and how I can work on them. With that being said, moving on to the question, how do you personally define economic justice, or do you have a personal experience with economic justice?
So I think the best way that I define economic justice is really thinking about the unequal distribution of income and opportunity. To me, that is economic justice, the unequal distribution of income and opportunity. And so then the justice part is really the removal of those inequalities to rectify that injustice. That's how I identify it in two parts. The second question, let me think a little bit more about my experiences of economic injustice. I would say that as a woman and a woman of color, I have been, and I worked at various institutions, I've been in a space where there was some difference in salary with my counterparts. And that was after negotiating and things of that nature and thinking that I was at a good level, and then finding out that I was still being underpaid for the same job as compared to my white counterparts. So that did happen to me a few years back. And really was an eye opener, right? Because you can write about this, learn about it, talk about this. And when it happens to you, it becomes an eye opener and really will motivate you to be more vocal about creating changes.
I would say, as far as like a nice, neat definition of economic justice for me, is the active and intentional work of improving access to power and resources for everyone. And so for me, economic justice, I think in many ways was my entry space into social justice work, because I knew I was poor before I knew I was gay. And, growing up in an area, I mean, when people, we often think of, I think back to what Dawn was saying about the stereotypes of poverty and homelessness and all these different things. People don't see a face that looks like mine when they think about this. But I grew up in a double wide trailer that literally was missing floors. Every person in my family fell through the floor of my house and was hospitalized at one point in my childhood. We had snakes and raccoons and things that would get into the house. We had an entire year where we had no water because a water main busted and we couldn't replace it. I thought I was not that poor because I knew people who didn't have doors on their houses. I knew people whose house was literally plywood boards stapled to a frame and then stapled with tarps over it. And if you drive through my region of the country, you'll still see that. So one of the things that I have committed to work in my life is I work with a coalition of other Appalachian activists to educate white folks about the impact of poverty in Appalachia and the impact of racism on our inability to build coalition outside of our communities. And so one of the things I go back regularly. I still host seminars. I go back to my high school. And I talk about the difference between class privilege and race privilege and how I faced so many barriers. I can't begin to tell you the barriers I faced as the only person who has ever gone to college in my family, and what it was like to go to a school where I went to the school with the daughter of the CEO of Pepsi Cola. So to go to a place where I was the poorest person I knew and nobody understood, and everyone's like, let's go to Applebee's. And I was like, I have 2 cents. But helping them understand that because they'll turn around and say, Roxy, with everything you've been through, how can you say white privilege exists? Well, now I work on a college campus, and never once in my entire career has someone stopped me on my own campus to demand my identification because they're not sure I work here. But how many of my Black colleagues has that happened to? No one has ever come up to me as a professional after a training and put their hands in my hair to talk about the texture as if I was an animal. But how many women of color has this happened to? Right? How many times have I gone to Walmart to buy shampoo and they had whatever I needed? Whereas how many women of color don't have that same experience? So I think once we are aware of this, we have to, that for me has been my economic justice work, is how do I make other white folks aware, particularly white folks from my region who have been told the problem is Black and brown folks, to recognize they have been sold a false bill of sale. Like, that's not it. And that we have just as much responsibility for dismantling racism as we do for dismantling economic injustice.
I thought those were really insightful answers. And my question is, how do you think we can achieve economic justice? And is it truly possible?
I do think it's possible, and I would never discourage folks by saying that it's not. But what I will say is you will likely plant trees for which you will never enjoy their shade. That this work is not something that happens in a month, a year, in a lifetime. This might be the work of generations, but that we have to work towards it. And I think we start at our, So we have, when we do our safe zone training, we talk about the 4 layers of allyship. And Dawn will remember this because I just talked about this in our leadership meeting, is we have to ask at the personal level, what am I willing to commit to? If I'm recognizing, if I take that implicit bias test and I find out I have an implicit bias towards Black people, what am I willing to do to unlearn that? Right? If my friend calls me out and says that I did something that was homophobic or classist or harmful, what am I willing to do to unlearn that? Then the interpersonal level, what am I willing to commit to in my friend group or in my family group to help others understand or to hold them accountable? Then there's the institutional level, which for right now is Rowan. But in a few years, that could be any number of organizations you'll be a part of. So what am I willing to do? What am I willing to advocate for or sacrifice in my organization to create policies that promote economic justice and social justice, racial justice, right? And then that last piece is societal. What do we need to advocate for? Maybe your role in this is becoming a congressman or running for president. I don't know. If you run for president, hit me up later and give me some perks, because I gave you the idea right here. But getting involved in the political forum, whether that's on the front line serving as a representative, or writing congressman, or get voting, or doing a voter campaign and creating voter access for folks who might not have it otherwise, which is also a major economic justice issue. But at those 4 levels, each level of allyship is a commitment and a sacrifice you're willing to make. And only you can decide how far you're willing to go, how much you're willing to give up, how much you're willing to put on the line. But I think it's lifelong work.
I definitely agree. I think that work starts with understanding that all of the isms are socially constructed, right? Whether we're talking about classism, whether we're talking about gender, we're talking about the fact that society has created these concepts, stereotypes, and the ways in which we behave around them. So if we as a society can start spreading awareness, if we can start reflecting on our own bias, if we can start continue to have difficult conversations, then you can bring about change. And once that change happens, as Roxy mentioned, it won't be perhaps in your time, maybe. I wish, right? I hope, wish, and pray that it could happen overnight, but we know that the systemic racism and institutionalized racism happened over years, right? Hundreds, right? So we have to understand that it has to be an incremental and a gradual process, and that starts with education, and that starts with society changing the construction of these concepts that they created in the first place. But making sure that we are invading those systems that are in hierarchical government policy makers that are creating the systems and then reinforcing the systems. And as Roxy mentioned, that happens in different ways. That happens in some folks becoming legislators. That happens with protesting. That happens with being the first, being trendsetters. That happens with being allies. That happens with creating forums and spaces and places to talk like this. But all of that feeds into creating a change for society.
Yeah, and I'd add, you can channel your passion, right? I don't know all of your majors, right? But I think sometimes we think that the work of social justice is the work of like a select few, but social justice can be done in any field, right? I mean, I think about one of the things, I came from a theater background, and I always work to create theater into my social justice work and how we empower people's voices and share and storytell. That can be your work, right? It could be that you're really interested in the stock market and all. I would say more about that, but I'll be honest, I know that stocks exist and I should own some, but that's what I've got for you. So talking about financial literacy, get yourself some financial literacy on the stock market, but maybe that's where your passion is. So you open a brokerage that prioritizes financial literacy and education for marginalized populations, right? Maybe you're going to be a school teacher and you're the person who advocates with your local school district to create affordable lunches. Maybe you're that teacher that has snacks always in the classroom, who's checking in with students. You can do this in so many different ways, but recognizing that it can be woven into your entire life, that work is the work of all of us.
I just want to start by saying that both of you have been very insightful and informative to this. We have roughly 5 minutes left, and I'd like to thank both of you again for coming here today to speak to us. Are there any closing remarks either of you have?
And I would just say the fact that you're here today means that you care about this. And the fact that you care about this will carry you through this work. And to know Dawn and I and a number of other folks, whether it's in DEI or across campus, are here to support you, here to help you, here to, if it's just you need someone to talk to, or you've got a vision for a project or a policy, we will help you get there. So know that you can continue to see us as a resource.
Roxy said it perfectly. We're a resource. We're here for you. Let us know if you need us.
I just want to thank both Roxy and Dr. Singleton again today for coming here and speaking to us.
All right. Yes, thank you both to our presenters and to everyone who attended today's session. Just to reiterate one more time, the session will be has been recorded and will be available next week on the Rowan Campus Recreation website. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening, and we have a couple more sessions tonight, so feel free to check those out.
PR